There is a moment that comes to almost everyone, usually without warning, when the people around you suddenly look like strangers, not because they changed, because you did. Most people spend years, sometimes decades, relating to a version of the people in their lives that never actually existed. A parent they invented in their own mind. A friend they built out of hope. A partner they painted in the colors of their own longing. And then one ordinary day, something cracks. A comment lands wrong. A silence lasts too long. A mask slips for half a second. And suddenly you are looking at the actual human being who has been standing in front of you the entire time. This video is about that day. The day the fog lifts. The day you stop seeing who you needed people to be and start seeing who they actually are. By the end of this, you will understand why that day feels less like a discovery and more like a loss, and why, strangely, it is the beginning of the only kind of freedom that lasts. Because here is the uncomfortable truth hiding underneath all of this. The people who hurt you rarely disguise themselves. You disguise them for them. And the work of seeing clearly is not really about them at all. It is about the parts of yourself you were avoiding by looking at them the wrong way. Stay with that thought. It gets much stranger before it gets useful. Let's begin. Every human relationship runs on two layers at once. There is the layer where two actual people exist, flawed, inconsistent, doing their best with what they were given. And there is a second layer, quieter, running underneath like a second soundtrack, where each person is also relating to an image. A projection. A story cast onto the other person like a film onto a blank wall. Most people never notice the second layer. They think they are in a relationship with a person. In reality, for long stretches of time, they are in a relationship with a picture they painted and then forgot they were holding the brush. This is not a flaw unique to naive people or damaged people. It is a structural feature of the human mind. We are pattern-completing machines. Give the brain a partial signal, a tone of voice, a glance, a single kind gesture, and it will fill in the rest using material from your own history, your own wounds, your own hopes. That filled-in picture feels like knowledge. It is not. It is inference wearing the costume of certainty. Think about the last time someone disappointed you in a way that felt almost like betrayal, even though, if you're honest, they never actually promised you anything. That sting wasn't only about what they did. It was about the gap between the person you had constructed in your imagination and the person who showed up. The bigger that gap, the deeper the wound, because you're not just losing a friend or a partner in that moment. You're losing a piece of your own internal world. Here is where it gets interesting, and where almost nobody looks closely enough. The image we project onto another person is rarely random. It tends to fall into a few recognizable shapes, and once you learn to recognize them, you start seeing them everywhere. In your own relationships, in the arguments you keep having, in the same disappointment showing up with a different face each time. The first shape is the rescuer. You meet someone in a moment of weakness, theirs or yours, and something in you casts them as the person who will finally understand you completely. Who will not leave, who will fix what nobody else could fix. You are not seeing them. You are seeing a solution to an old problem, dressed in a new person's clothes. The second shape is the mirror of your own unlived life. This is the person who seems to have the courage you never allowed yourself, the freedom you talked yourself out of, the confidence you buried under years of caution. You don't just admire them, you need them to be exactly that, because their existence proves it's possible. When they turn out to be ordinary, anxious, insecure, contradictory, just like everyone else, it doesn't just disappoint you. It can feel like betrayal, because unconsciously, you had outsourced a part of your own hope to them. The third shape is the one nobody wants to admit to, and it is the most important. It is the person onto whom you project everything you cannot stand about yourself, every fault, every weakness, every quality you were taught early and often was unacceptable. You don't see it in the mirror. You see it in them. and you react to it in them with an intensity that never quite matches the size of what they actually did. If you have ever been furious at someone for something almost embarrassingly small, a tone, a habit, a way of laughing, and felt that fury was somehow bigger than the moment deserved, you were very likely standing face to face with your own shadow, wearing someone else's features. This idea, the shadow, deserves its own moment, because almost everything else in this video builds on it. Picture the mind as a house. Some rooms are lit, furnished, open for guests. That's the self you show the world, the self you're comfortable being. But every house built with light also has rooms that never got a lamp. Rooms where things you were told not to be got locked away. Your anger, your selfishness, your jealousy, your neediness. Sometimes even your brilliance. If brilliance once made you a target, nobody destroys those rooms. You cannot delete a part of yourself simply because it was inconvenient for the people raising you. You can only close the door. And a closed door does not mean an empty room. It means a room you stopped looking into. Here is the part that changes everything, once you actually absorb it. What you refuse to look at inside yourself does not vanish. It gets projected outward onto other people, where it becomes easier to fight, easier to judge, easier to hate. Because hating it in someone else costs nothing, while facing it in yourself costs your entire self-image. This is why the people who irritate you the most, the ones who trigger a reaction that feels disproportionate and immediate, are often unintentionally showing you a door in your own house that you have not opened in years. But this creates another problem, and it's the one that quietly ruins more relationships than almost anything else. If you are unconsciously casting people in roles from your own internal drama, rescuer, hope, shadow, then the day you finally see someone clearly is not a small adjustment. It is a small death. You are not just updating your opinion of them. You are losing the character they were playing in the story you were telling yourself about your own life. And grief, real grief, follows almost every act of clear seeing. This is why people describe the moment they saw someone for who they really are, using words that sound almost violent. Waking up, getting slapped by reality, having the rug pulled out. Nobody says it felt gentle. It rarely does, because what's dying in that moment isn't the relationship. It's a version of yourself that depended on the illusion. Let me give you a story that makes this concrete, because abstract ideas fade fast, but stories stay. There was a young executive, brilliant, ambitious, the kind of person who reads every leadership book twice, who spent nearly a decade orbiting a mentor he considered nearly infallible. Every decision this mentor made, he defended. Every flaw he explained away. In his mind, this man represented everything he wanted to become: composed, respected, untouchable. Then, during a company crisis, he watched his mentor do something quietly cowardly. Protect his own position at the cost of people who trusted him, small, almost invisible to everyone else in the room. But he saw it, and in that instant, the mentor didn't become a worse person. He became a real one, fallible, frightened, human, in the least flattering sense of the word. What happened next surprises almost everyone who hears this story. The young executive didn't just lose respect for his mentor. He fell into a kind of quiet depression for months, one he couldn't explain to anyone, because on paper nothing bad had happened to him personally. What he had actually lost was the fantasy that composure could exist without cost, that you could reach a level of success where fear stopped mattering. He had built his own sense of what was possible on top of another person's image. When the image cracked, the foundation went with it. Most people stop here. They either cling harder to the old image, explaining away evidence for years, or they swing to the opposite extreme and decide the other person was a fraud all along, rewriting the entire relationship in one bitter stroke. Both are ways of avoiding the harder work, which is grieving the illusion without discarding the actual complicated human being underneath it. Here's what almost nobody notices about that harder work. It isn't really about the other person changing your opinion of them. It's about you being willing to hold two things at once. This person genuinely mattered to me, and this person is not, and was never, who I needed them to be. Most minds want to collapse that tension into a simple story, because simple stories are less painful than contradictions. But the people who eventually see others clearly and stay in relationship with them anyway are the ones who can tolerate that tension without needing to resolve it into a fairy tale or a villain origin story. Now here is where the emotional temperature needs to rise, because so far this has mostly been about them. It's time to turn the lens around. If projection works the way we've described, if you cast rescuers, mirrors, and shadows onto the people around you, then somebody right now, quite possibly several people, are doing the exact same thing to you. You are in someone else's internal drama, playing a role you never auditioned for. You might be someone's proof that good people exist. You might be carrying someone's disowned anger, or their buried ambition, or their fear of being ordinary. And the moment they see you clearly, not as the role, but as the person, you will feel it. It will feel like being dropped. Like someone stopped loving you, when really, they stopped needing a fantasy that happened to be wearing your face. This reframes a particular kind of pain that almost everyone carries, and almost nobody names correctly. The friend who pulled away without explanation, the partner whose warmth cooled overnight, the mentor who suddenly seemed distant. In many of these cases, nothing you did caused it. What happened is that they finally saw you, and seeing you meant losing something they had built you into. Their grief looked, from the outside, like rejection of you. It was actually the death of a story about themselves, one that happened to be staged inside their relationship with you. This is not a comfortable thought. It is, however, an enormously freeing one, because it means an enormous amount of relational pain in your life was never a verdict on your worth. It was collateral damage from someone else's unfinished internal work. And once you can see that clearly, in real time, you stop absorbing every withdrawal, every coldness, every sudden distance as proof that something is wrong with you. But there's a trap hiding inside that comfort, and it's important enough to name directly. It is tempting, once you understand projection, to use it as an excuse, to explain away every conflict as someone else's shadow, someone else's unfinished business, someone else's fantasy collapsing. This becomes its own kind of blindness, just pointed outward instead of inward. Real clarity requires the harder, less flattering question every single time. What part of this reaction is coming from them, and what part is coming from me? That question is uncomfortable, precisely because it never lets you fully win an argument in your own head, and that discomfort is exactly the signal that you're doing it correctly. Let's talk about how this actually shows up day to day, because theory without application evaporates within a week. The first sign that you're seeing someone through a projection rather than through clear eyes is intensity that doesn't match the situation. A small disappointment that produces a large reaction. A minor disagreement that feels like a referendum on the entire relationship. When your emotional response to something is bigger than the event itself, that gap is not noise. It's information. It's usually telling you that an old story just got triggered, and the person in front of you is only partly the cause of what you're feeling. The second sign is when you find yourself defending someone against evidence, rather than engaging with the evidence itself. Explaining away, minimizing, finding endless justifications for a pattern you would immediately flag in anyone else's life. This is usually a sign that losing your image of them would cost you more than you're consciously willing to admit. The third sign, and this one is subtle, is idealization that arrives too fast. When you meet someone and within weeks feel that they understand you like no one ever has, that they are unlike anyone you've encountered before, pause. Sometimes that speed is genuine connection, often especially when it comes with a rush of relief. It's a role being cast quickly because a vacancy in your internal story needed filling urgently. None of these signs mean the other person is bad, or that the relationship is fake. They mean it's time to look twice, slowly, at what you're actually seeing versus what you're supplying from your own unfinished material. Here's where things become interesting, because projection doesn't only distort people you know closely. It distorts entire categories of strangers, and this shows up most clearly in how quickly people fall for public figures who seem to have it all figured out. Consider the businessman who built a company from nothing and became, for millions of people who had never met him, a symbol of what discipline could achieve if you simply wanted it badly enough. Interviews were quoted like scripture. His morning routine got dissected on forums, as though it contained a hidden formula. People who had never spoken to him for longer than the length of a podcast episode built entire identities around emulating a man they had. In reality, constructed almost entirely from a highlight reel. Years later, when reporting surfaced, showing a pattern of private cruelty toward the people who worked closest to him, something strange happened. It wasn't just criticism. It was fury from people who had never met him, who had no personal stake in his behavior at all. That fury is worth sitting with for a moment, because its size gives away its source. You don't get that angry at a stranger's flaws unless that stranger was at some point carrying a piece of your own hope. This is the same mechanism at work, just scaled up to a public stage. Distance doesn't protect you from projection. If anything, distance makes it easier, because a stranger offers less resistance than someone who might contradict the fantasy in real time. A famous face, seen only through careful editing, is often an even better canvas for your own unfinished story than the people who actually sit across the table from you. The practical lesson here cuts both ways, and it's uncomfortable in both directions. The first is that admiration from a distance should always be held a little more loosely than admiration built through years of direct contact, because you have far less information than the feeling suggests you do. The second, and this is the one people resist more, is that the outrage you feel toward public figures deserves the same scrutiny as any other outsized emotional reaction. Not because cruelty shouldn't be named as cruelty, it should, but because the intensity of your own reaction is often telling you something about what you needed that person to represent, and how betrayed you feel now that the representation collapsed. This matters because it explains why some people can hear about the same public failure and shrug, while others feel it almost like a personal wound. The difference usually isn't information. It's how much of their own story they had quietly loaned to that person, without ever asking whether the loan was safe. So how does someone actually get to the other side of this, to the place where they can look at another person and see them, mostly, as they actually are, rather than as a character in an unconscious play? It starts with a practice that sounds almost too simple to matter, and is exactly why most people skip it, noticing the reaction before explaining the reaction. Most people, the instant they feel a strong emotional charge towards someone, immediately jump to justifying it. He deserved that anger. She earned that disappointment. The story gets written before the feeling has even finished arriving. The practice is to pause in that gap, just for a few seconds, and ask what this reaction might be showing you about your own history, before deciding what it says about the other person. This does not mean distrusting every feeling you have. It means treating strong feelings as data worth examining rather than verdicts to be obeyed instantly. Over time, this single habit does more to clear your vision of other people than almost anything else, because it slowly drains the swamp that projections grow out of. The second part of this work is learning to tolerate disappointment without converting it into either idealization or contempt. When someone shows you a flaw, the mind wants a quick resolution. Either explain it away so the pedestal survives, or tear the pedestal down entirely and declare them worthless. Both are escapes from the much harder middle position. This person has this flaw and they still matter, and I can hold both facts without needing either one to disappear. This middle position is where real relationships actually live. Not in the fantasy of a flawless person, and not in the bitterness of a fallen one, but in the ongoing, occasionally disappointing, occasionally surprising reality of two imperfect people, choosing each other again and again, with open eyes instead of borrowed ones. There is a story worth telling here about a woman who spent years believing her father was simply cold, distant, unreachable, more interested in his work than his family. She built an entire identity around this wound, the unloved daughter of an emotionally absent man. It explained everything about her, in her own private narrative, why she struggled to trust people, why she chased approval, why warmth from others always felt suspicious to her, like it must be hiding something. Late in his life, going through old boxes after a small house fire, she found letters he had written but never sent to her mother, to people from decades earlier, full of a tenderness and fear he had apparently never once let show on his face. He hadn't been cold, he had been terrified in a way he had no idea how to express. Raised by people who had punished any softness out of him as a child, she didn't just update a fact about her father that day. She lost the entire architecture of a story she had used to explain her own life for 30 years. And here's what surprised her most. The grief was almost unbearable, heavier than she expected mourning a living man to be, because she wasn't only grieving who he actually was, she was grieving every year she had spent relating to a version of him that had never existed, and every decision she had made based on that fiction. This is the sharpest edge of seeing people as they really are. It doesn't just cost you your image of them. It can cost you the story you built about yourself, using them as a supporting character. And that is precisely why so many people, on some level, choose not to look too closely. Clarity is expensive. The mind, quite reasonably, avoids expensive things unless something forces the issue. Something usually does, eventually. A crisis, a betrayal, a quiet moment of unexpected honesty, like a box of old letters. And when it does, you are left with a choice that determines almost everything about the next chapter of your life. Do you rebuild an even more elaborate fiction to replace the one that just collapsed? Or do you finally look, without flinching, at the actual human beings around you, including the one in the mirror? This is where the deepest insight of all this waits, and it is worth slowing down for, because it changes the entire meaning of everything said so far. The day you truly see people as they are is not, in the end, primarily a day about them. It is the day you stop needing other people to complete a story you were too afraid to finish writing yourself. Every rescuer you cast was someone you hoped would save you from doing your own difficult work. Every hero you built was a stand-in for the courage you hadn't yet claimed as your own. Every villain you exaggerated was carrying weight that belonged, at least in part, to a room in your own house you still hadn't opened. Seeing others clearly and becoming whole in yourself are not two separate achievements. They are the same movement, viewed from two different angles. As you integrate the disowned parts of yourself, the anger, the ambition, the fear, the softness you were told to hide, you need less and less from the people around you. You stop requiring them to be extraordinary, because you no longer need someone else's extraordinariness to borrow hope from. You stop requiring them to be villains, because you're no longer using their darkness to avoid looking at your own. What's left, when the fantasy burns away, is something quieter and far sturdier than either idealization or contempt. Actual respect for an actual person, flaws included, the relief of no longer performing a role in someone else's unconscious drama, and the strange, hard-won piece of a relationship with a parent, a partner, a friend, a version of yourself, built on what's real instead of what you needed to be true. That peace does not arrive instantly. It comes in stages, usually after several rounds of disappointment, several collapsed illusions, several uncomfortable mornings of asking whether the anger you're feeling is really about them or really about you. but each round makes the next one easier, because each round hands a little more of your own house back to you. Fewer locked rooms, fewer strangers wearing familiar faces, fewer people you need to be more or less than they are. And on the other side of that long, uneven process is the day this video is named for. Not a dramatic day usually, often a quiet one. You're sitting across from someone, a parent, an old friend, a partner, maybe even a version of the person staring back in the mirror. And for the first time in a long while, you're not measuring them against who you needed them to be. You're just looking, clearly, without flinching, and what you see finally is simply true. That is the beginning, not the end, of the only kind of relationship with others and with yourself that can actually hold weight over a lifetime. If this changed the way you see the people closest to you, stay close, because the next lesson goes even deeper, into the parts of yourself you haven't looked at yet, and what happens the day you finally do.